Peyton Lloyd.
And my name is Scarlett Ramsey.
My name is Dean Fox.
And our topic was domestic violence criminal justice reform. So to add some context to our topic, domestic violence is defined as abuse within intimate relationships. The National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, which is a nonprofit organization that works to advocate and represent victims who've experienced domestic violence, quotes that every minute, 20 people experience domestic violence in the U.S. They also go on to quote that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men experience domestic violence in their lifetime. Domestic violence is a very prevalent and common issue within our country that affects not only victims, but also people surrounding them. It poses the question, what can we do or what can we change within our criminal justice system to lower the rates and make this a less common issue within our country?
So we decided to ask ourselves, what are the best reforms that the criminal justice system can put in place to protect victims of domestic violence and hold perpetrators liable?
Our team came up with a solution of implementing domestic violence courts, which are specialized courts that follow certain parameters that are specific to domestic violence cases, using evidence-based sentencing to eliminate bias, which is it's just using strictly evidence, facts, nothing with judgment, and then also using these specialized courts and all that in a combination to hopes of lowering recidivism, which is just the likelihood of a convicted offender to convict or reoffend a crime of a similar nature.
Okay, and the first piece of evidence that we chose was domestic violence courts use a one judge, one family approach. And according to Jennifer Koshan, IDV courts are said to focus on the goals of victim safety and offender accountability with the provision of victim support services and mandated offender treatment as key features. Additionally, domestic violence courts, the one judge approach avoids conflicting orders, has a holistic perspective on family matters, it has efficient case management, enhanced monitoring, and it has streamlined support services.
The Institute for Youth and Policy, which is an organization that looks at issues within our country and fights to see what policies we could put in place to create less issues, they cite that the percentage of victim-advocate relationships rose from 55 to 100% following the opening of the Brooklyn Felony Domestic Violence Court, displaying just how effective domestic violence courts are. This is just one example in our country of how domestic violence courts are already making a change in victim advocacy. They ensure legal and ethical action is taken and also that the proper procedures are put in place post-sentencing as well. A quote again from the Institute for Youth and Policy, a strong emphasis is placed on rehabilitation and deterrence mechanisms and increased consequences for noncompliance. Again, just going further into depth about how these courts focus not only to ensure that proper justice is given to the victim, but also that there's things followed up post-sentencing to ensure that offenders don't reconvict a crime and that less people are impacted.
Also from the Institute for Youth and Policy, they say domestic violence courts are undoubtedly having a positive impact on the criminal justice system. This emphasizes the effectiveness of the domestic violence courts within the challenges that the domestic violence and sexual assault cases have, because they are truly like no other cases, and that's why they can't be treated like any other cases. Domestic violence courts focus on victim-centered safety and helping victims and survivors throughout the whole legal process. That's why they really focus on emphasizing evidence-based sentencing that aim to rehabilitate offenders and reduce recidivism. By implementing this, we can prioritize victim safety and hold offenders accountable to prevent repeat offenses, ultimately creating a better criminal justice system better equipped for domestic violence cases.
However, they still have their limitations as domestic violence courts sometimes prioritize settlements and misrepresent victims. And what that means is that domestic violence courts can sometimes have an inconsistent prioritization of safety, which means that the courts can sometimes grant unsupervised visitation to offenders, which can put families at risk. It has a high settlement pressure, which means that victims can feel pressured into taking settlement money, which can make the abuse they experience feel downplayed by the victim. And it has a limited impact on recidivism, which means that domestic violence courts don't have a high emphasis on having offenders not recidivize. However, the implications of our topic is that with the inclusion of evidence-based sentencing in our team solution as standard practice in domestic violence courts, it can help rectify some of the current issues in domestic violence courts currently, because evidence-based sentencing has a higher impact on recidivism because it can place offenders in rehabilitation programs that are proven to show less recidivism.
An alternate solution our team thought of was the implementation of psychological intervention. The American Psychological Association Dictionary of Psychology defines psychological interventions as action on the part of a psychotherapist to deal with problems of the client. So psychological intervention can range anywhere from your standard therapy, counseling, to rehab, to anger management. There's a wide variety, but not everyone reacts the same to these certain types of interventions. Although psychological intervention is an ethical and humane way to help deal with problems, it also is not really effective. It's not guaranteed to be effective. So everyone, again, reacts differently to different types of interventions, so it's not guaranteed to actually change behaviors within a person. Thomas P. George, who has a PhD in sociology and works in the criminal justice department, quotes that sentencing with anger management interventions were associated with lower odds of recidivism. So it just goes on about how psychological intervention is really effective in changing behavior in a person, the more psychological aspect, but again, it is not guaranteed to help, and it can only really be beneficial post-sentencing, as that's when it's implemented.
While looking at systematic bias within domestic violence cases, we saw that it can really stem from law enforcement officers within the legal process. That is why we decided to look at the 8 set principles outlined by the United States Department of Justice as our ultimate solution. This training focuses to prevent all bias within domestic violence and sexual assault cases, truly recognizing and addressing the bias that had been had by these law enforcement officers. The key actions that the officers will take is truly treating all victims with respect throughout the whole legal process while they are interacting with each other, and truly ensuring effective investigations to know the whole part of the case and really using that evidence-based sentencing, and referring all victims and survivors to the correct resources that they need throughout everything. Although this is not guaranteed, and that is why not guaranteed to help every case, and that's why we didn't use this as our main argument, because it is often not proactive, and it's only helping within the legal process, and it's not helping the initial abuse that is being had within these cases. And that is why it can't help really with long-term change within domestic violence. It can only help within the legal process.
And finally, circling back to our main solution, domestic violence continues to affect millions of individuals, and to protect victims and keep vulnerable individuals such as women and children safe, domestic violence courts are needed. And here are our citations.
Cooley, describe how the content of the team presentation was changed as a result of group discussions.
It was changed as a result of group discussions because originally we were going to look at Scarlett's solution of police training, but after looking at Scarlett's research and how, like, the limitations that it had and that it isn't always guaranteed to protect victims thoroughly, we decided to change it to domestic violence courts as our main solution because it has a way higher likelihood of protecting every victim, like, equally.
And Peyton, give one specific way that your thinking changed as a result of learning about Cooley's findings.
So Cooley's findings, his research was mainly about the specialized domestic violence courts. So it was, we were able to kind of combine our ideas. I had some research on evidence-based sentencing to kind of eliminate bias, and so we were really able to focus our project around his findings just because it ended up being our main solution, and we were also able to incorporate some of our other ideas but use his as like a main focus.
Scarlett, what is one way in which your team's resolution makes you think differently about your own individual research?
So one way that our team resolution changed my individual research is the solution of evidence-based sentencing in these specialized courts. I had no idea, honestly, that these specialized courts were a thing, and I noticed when doing my research, I was looking at the systematic bias within the criminal justice system in a whole and not looking at these specialized courts. So I kind of did not realize that this bias could be eliminated within these specialized courts because I was looking at the whole criminal justice system in one.
Thank you.